They say he is born under Mars, a warrior's star, but also under Saturn's shadow, and I will teach him to survive both.
In the heart of the 17th century Ottoman Empire, within the towering walls of Topkapi Palace, a story unfolded that would shape the destiny of an empire. This is not merely a tale of kings and conquests, but a bond forged in darkness, tempered by blood, and sealed by an unwavering devotion that transcended the very nature of power itself. This is the story of Sultan Murad IV and Kosem Sultan, a relationship so complex, so deeply intertwined with the fate of the Ottoman throne, that it blurred the lines between maternal love, political alliance, and the brutal necessities of imperial survival. The birth of shadows. The year was 1612. The Ottoman Empire, once the terror and envy of Europe, found itself teetering on the edge of chaos. Within the gilded cages of the harem, a young woman named Anastasia, a Greek girl captured and brought to Constantinople, had already transformed herself into something far more formidable. She had become Kosem, meaning the leader of the flock, and she had captured the heart of Sultan Ahmed I. But her ambitions stretched far beyond the bedchamber of a sultan. When Kosem gave birth to a son in 1612,
trust no one but
she
me,
named him Murad.
not even your own
The
shadow.
palace astrologers whispered of omens, of a child born under a warrior's star, but none could predict the darkness that would shape his youth. Ahmed I died young, at only 27, leaving behind an empire in turmoil and a harem full of princes, any one of whom could be seen as a threat to whoever ascended the throne. The throne passed not to Kosem's sons, but to Ahmed's brother, Mustafa I, a man whose mind had been shattered by years of confinement in the caves, the golden cage where Ottoman princes were kept to prevent rebellion. His reign lasted mere months before he was deposed. Then came Kosem's own son, Osman II, Murad's older brother, who took the throne at merely 14 years of age. Young Murad, still a child, watched as his brothers struggled with the weight of the crown. He saw the Janissaries, the elite military corps that had once been the empire's greatest strength, grow corrupt and unruly. He witnessed palace intrigues, assassination attempts, and the constant threat of death that hung over every member of the royal family. But most importantly, he watched his mother, Kosem Sultan, navigate these treacherous waters with a skill that bordered on genius. The tragedy that forged iron. In 1622, when Murad was only 10 years old, catastrophe struck. The Janissaries, enraged by Osman II's attempts to reform their corps and curtail their power, rose in rebellion. They stormed the palace, and despite Kosem's desperate attempts to protect her son, they dragged the young sultan from his throne. Osman was taken to the infamous Yedikule fortress, where he was strangled to death, his body subjected to unspeakable brutalities. He was only 17 years old. Murad witnessed the aftermath of his brother's murder. He saw his mother's grief transform into something harder, colder. Kosem Sultan had learned a terrible lesson. Mercy was a luxury the Ottoman throne could not afford. She had tried to protect Osman through negotiation and compromise, and it had cost her son his life. She would not make the same mistake again. The mad Mustafa was briefly restored to the throne, but his incapacity was so evident that within a year, the power brokers of the empire turned to Kosem's next son. In 1623, at the age of 11, Murad ascended to the throne as Sultan Murad IV. But he was sultan in name only. Real power rested in the hands of his mother, Kosem Sultan, who became the effective ruler of the Ottoman Empire as regent. The regent and her emperor. The relationship between Murad and his mother during these early years was complex beyond measure. Kosem loved her son fiercely. There was no doubt of that. Every decision she made, every political maneuver, every execution she ordered was done to protect Murad and secure his throne. But her love was not gentle. It could not afford to be. She taught him that the throne was not a gift, but a burden, one that demanded constant vigilance. She showed him the bodies of those who had plotted against him, making sure he understood that his life hung by a thread every single day. When rebellions broke out in Anatolia, when the Janissaries grew restless, when the treasury ran empty, Kosem handled it all, and Murad watched and learned. But as Murad grew from boy to young man, something changed within him. The trauma of his brother's murder, the constant atmosphere of threat and violence, the weight of being sultan without true power, all of this began to shape him into something his mother had not anticipated. Where Kosem had learned cunning and political mastery, Murad learned rage. Where she had learned to manipulate and maneuver, he learned to dominate and destroy. By his teenage years, Murad had grown into a young man of extraordinary physical prowess. He trained obsessively with weapons, becoming one of the finest archers and swordsmen in the empire. He was tall, powerfully built, with eyes that burned with an intensity that made even hardened warriors uncomfortable. And increasingly, he chafed under his mother's control. The struggle for power. The first real crisis in their relationship came in 1632, when Murad was 20 years old. For nearly a decade, he had watched his mother rule in his name, and while he understood the necessity of it during his childhood, he now believed himself ready to truly become sultan. But Kosem was not ready to relinquish power. She had spent years building networks of loyalty, placing her people in key positions, and she feared what Murad's inexperience might cost them. Their arguments behind closed doors became legendary among palace servants. Murad demanded autonomy, the right to make his own decisions, to lead his own armies. Kosem insisted that he was not yet ready, that the empire's enemies would exploit any weakness, that his impetuousness would be his downfall. Both were driven by love, by a desire to protect what they held dear, but their visions of how to do so had diverged. The turning point came with the catastrophic military defeats the empire suffered. The Safavid Persians captured Baghdad, one of the empire's most important cities. Polish forces made gains in the north. Everywhere, the Ottoman Empire seemed to be in retreat, and the whispers began. Whispers that said Kosem Sultan's feminine rule had weakened the empire, that what was needed was a strong warrior sultan in the tradition of the great conquerors. Murad heard these whispers, and they fed something dark within him. In 1632, he made his move. With the support of key military commanders who believed the empire needed a warrior on the throne, Murad effectively seized power from his mother. It was not a violent coup. There was no need for that. Murad simply began issuing orders in his own name, orders that superseded his mother's, and the palace officials, reading the wind, began to obey him instead of Kosem. For Kosem Sultan, this was both a triumph and a tragedy. She had raised a son strong enough to claim his throne exactly as she had intended. But in doing so, she had also created someone who no longer needed her, someone who might even see her as a threat. Their relationship entered a new and dangerous phase. The warrior Sultan emerges. What followed was one of the most brutal and effective reigns in Ottoman history. Murad IV became a sultan of legendary severity. He banned alcohol, tobacco, and coffee throughout the empire, personally patrolling the streets of Constantinople in disguise, executing violators on the spot with his own hands. Stories spread of the Sultan appearing like a phantom in taverns and coffee houses, his sword already drawn, offering no warning before taking heads. He turned his attention to the corruption that had rotted the empire from within. Officials who had grown rich on bribes found themselves impaled on stakes. Janissaries who had murdered his brother and terrorized the palace were systematically hunted down and executed. Murad showed no mercy, no hesitation. It was said he personally executed over 25,000 people during his reign, and while that number may be exaggerated, the terror he inspired was very real. Kosem watched all of this with mixed emotions. On one hand, Murad was doing what needed to be done. The empire's enemies respected strength, and Murad was demonstrating strength in abundance. The rebellions that had plagued the empire began to quiet. The Janissaries, for the first time in decades, feared their sultan more than they feared the loss of their privileges. On the other hand, Kosem saw the toll this was taking on her son's soul, saw him becoming more isolated, more paranoid, more willing to see threats everywhere. Their relationship during this period was strained but never broken. Murad still consulted his mother on important matters, still valued her political insight, even if he no longer always followed her advice. And Kosem, for her part, supported her son publicly even when she disagreed with him privately. She understood that any sign of division between them would be exploited by their enemies. The campaign for Baghdad. In 1638, Murad made the decision that would define his legacy. He would personally lead an army to recapture Baghdad from the Safavid Persians. This was an enormous risk. No Ottoman sultan had personally led an army in generations, and if Murad failed, if he was killed or defeated, the empire might collapse in a civil war. Kosem opposed the campaign. She argued that Murad's place was in Constantinople, that he could send generals to recapture Baghdad, that the risk was too great. Their arguments on this matter were fierce, with Murad accusing his mother of trying to keep him weak and controlled, and Kosem desperately trying to make him understand that she was only trying to protect him. But Murad would not be swayed. He assembled an army of over 100,000 men, the largest Ottoman force in decades, and marched east. Kosem remained in Constantinople, managing the capital in his absence, ensuring that no rebellion could take root while the Sultan was away. Despite their disagreements, they worked in perfect coordination. Murad led the sword, Kosem wielded the intrigue. The siege of Baghdad was brutal. Murad showed no mercy to the Persian defenders, executing prisoners and displaying their heads as warnings. When the city finally fell after 40 days of siege, Murad ordered a massacre that shocked even hardened soldiers. But he had succeeded where others had failed. Baghdad was Ottoman once again, and Murad returned to Constantinople not just as sultan, but as a conquering hero. The final years, an unbreakable bond. Murad's triumph at Baghdad should have been the beginning of a new golden age, but instead, it marked the beginning of the end. The campaign had taken a terrible toll on Murad's health. Years of excessive drinking, despite his own ban on alcohol, combined with the stress of his brutal rule and the physical demands of the campaign, had damaged his body. He suffered from gout, cirrhosis, and other ailments that left him in constant pain. As his health declined, something remarkable happened. The tension between Murad and Kosem faded, replaced by a deep understanding. Murad, facing his own mortality at only 28 years old, came to appreciate everything his mother had done for him, every sacrifice she had made, every difficult decision she had shouldered. And Kosem, seeing her son in pain, remembered not the fearsome warrior sultan, but the little boy who had clung to her after his brother's murder. In the final months of his life, Murad became obsessed with ensuring the succession. He had no surviving sons. His children had all died young, another source of pain that haunted him. The throne would pass to his brother Ibrahim, who had spent years locked in the caves and showed signs of the same madness that had afflicted Mustafa. Murad knew this, and it tormented him. On his deathbed in 1640, Murad called for his mother. The exact words spoken between them in those final moments have been lost to history. But the servants who stood outside the chamber reported hearing Murad weeping, something none had ever witnessed from the Iron Sultan. Kosem emerged from the chamber with tears streaming down her face, but when asked what had been said, she only replied that a mother and son had made peace. The legacy. Murad IV died on the 8th of February, 1640, at just 27 years old, the same age his father had been. His death plunged Kosem into grief so profound that she secluded herself for weeks. When she finally emerged, she had once again transformed herself. Ibrahim might be mad, but he was her son, and she would protect him and guide the empire just as she had done for Murad. The relationship between Murad and Kosem was never simple. It was not a fairy tale of maternal love, though love was certainly present. It was not merely a political alliance, though politics shaped every aspect of it. It was something far more complex, a bond forged in tragedy, tested by power, and ultimately transcending both. Kosem had raised Murad in the shadow of his brother's murder, had taught him that the throne demanded ruthlessness, that mercy was weakness, that power was the only true security. And Murad had absorbed those lessons perhaps too well, becoming a sultan so severe that even his mother sometimes feared what he had become. Yet through it all, they remained bound to each other, mother and son, regent and emperor, two souls shaped by the same darkness, fighting for the same throne. Murad's reign, though brief, restored the Ottoman Empire's military prestige and internal stability. His recapture of Baghdad and his iron-fisted suppression of corruption and rebellion gave the empire another century of life. But the personal cost was enormous. Murad died young, his body destroyed by the very excesses he had tried to ban, his soul scarred by the violence he had inflicted. And Kosem, the woman who had guided two sultans and would later attempt to guide a third, learned the hardest lesson of all. You can raise a lion, you can teach it to hunt, you can point at your enemies, but you can never truly control it. Murad had been her greatest creation and her greatest fear, a son who loved her deeply, but who could not, remain in her shadow. Closing. In the end, the story of Murad IV and Kosem Sultan is a reminder that power and love are not always opposing forces. Sometimes they are two sides of the same coin, each shaping and transforming the other in ways both beautiful and terrible. Their relationship, born in the blood-soaked corridors of Topkapi Palace, defined by the brutal necessities of imperial survival, and ended in grief and reconciliation, stands as one of the most compelling and complex bonds in Ottoman history. From the shadows of the harem to the throne of an empire, they walked together through darkness, their fates inseparable, their love undeniable, their legacy eternal. This was the true story of Sultan Murad IV and Kosem Sultan, a bond that shaped an empire and echoed through the centuries, proving that even in the midst of absolute power, the human heart remains the most powerful force of all.